My name is Charles Hernick. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, and I'll welcome my panel to the stage here, and we can take a seat. Not in the order that they're coming in, well, I guess I can do it. Vanessa Tutos, Director of Government and Regulatory Affairs for EDP Renewables. We can go ahead and sit down. Next to her, Ben LaRocco, Senior Manager of Policy for Lime. You're familiar with the scooters that are around town. And then next to him, Angie Slaughter, Vice President of Sustainability, Logistics, and Capabilities Procurement for Anheuser-Busch. And then at the end, last but not least, Bernadette Woods-Placky, Chief Meteorologist and Climate Matters Program Director with ClimateCentral.org. Thanks to my distinguished panel for getting here. And we are really going to get it started with a good conversation. The room is now full. We had to pad it a little bit with a congressman and a senator so that everybody could have time to get here. I was stuck in traffic myself. I'm excited about this conversation. We're talking about the mainstreaming of clean energy. And I hope that when you all walk away from the conversation at the end of the day, you have a firm understanding of where the new baseline has been set. And as I was looking, at our panel here, I was kind of struck, maybe we should have called this the 5 senses of clean energy. Very specifically, feel, from wind and sun in terms of what we'll talk about with weather power, smell and taste. Everybody knows the smell and taste of beer. What you see from Lime scooters all around town, and then the touch, really the tangibility of the supply chain that's been able to meet this surging demand for clean energy. So we're going to kick things off with a video here. So if we can go ahead and get that rolling, we'll start with that and then talk.
And there's a new tool that we're going to use to quantify how much electricity we're getting coming from solar and from wind. We are really in a good spot to get more energy out of the wind. And you can see the effects here for today. You can see here the equivalent car miles, the equivalent trees planted, and the equivalent smartphones charged. And I think this is a really cool thing to look at.
Now, with all of the sunshine in the forecast today and tomorrow, it is a great time if you solar power your home. Look at our solar power index coming in from Climate Central today and tomorrow at a perfect 10.
So thank you, Bernadette, for putting together that video ahead of the conference here. People trust their local meteorologist. And I used to joke when I was younger that despite the fact that meteorologists don't get it right all the time, people really are glued to their television when there's a tropical depression or a storm or a nor'easter or whatever it is, to really understand, and meteorologists are a trusted local voice in the community. Why did Climate Central do this project? Why did you all undertake a project to help train and educate and provide a resource for the folks that are doing our weathercasting?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us here today, and really enjoying getting in front of this crowd because it's not my normal crowd that I talk to. I'm usually at science and media conferences, so this is really exciting. Thank you. The project itself started with the concept of trusted messengers. More broadly, though, Climate Central is an organization, a nonprofit organization, that researches and reports in the science, the impacts, and solutions of climate change, all things climate change. And when we started our program, Climate Matters, about 6-7 years ago now, well, actually a little bit longer than that, I guess years are adding up, the whole goal was to work with trusted messengers in their communities where they're a local voice. They are skilled science communicators, and they are on the front lines of climate change. Most people experience climate change through some version of the weather, whether it be changes in their daily weather or extreme weather. So that's where the whole concept of the program started. Now, over the years, we've really grown and expanded. We're working with nearly 800 TV meteorologists in the United States right now.
Wow.
And for perspective, there are 2,200. So it gives you some version of the scale where we've come.
Yeah.
It's come a long way in their understanding of the science and how to bring that into their broadcasts. And along that chain, what became so obvious to me is wind and solar is weather. This is weather. And you have these TV meteorologists already doing pollen forecasts, UV forecasts, boating forecasts, which are essentially wind and solar forecasts. So we were able to create this tool. It took a couple of years, resource dependent, but what it does is it takes weather forecast information, it pairs it with current installations of wind and solar across the country, and then it aggregates it into different geographic areas. Now, for the TV meteorologists, we work with market areas. So for DC, it expands into Maryland and into Virginia, and then it spits all that out into the different metrics that you saw and into prepared graphics so that they can bring it right into their weathercast.
So I love the tool, and I'm glad that we were able to show it to folks a little bit. I'm someone who's worked on energy and environmental issues all of my life, and step one when you're trying to tackle an environmental problem is like, well, where's the environment? Like, what are we talking about? And so I feel like this is a great and very tangible way to bring that into people's living rooms or in the kitchen when folks are watching, the weather in the morning. Let's shift it over to something that really does touch my heart, Angie, and we can talk about Budweiser beer. You all took out and paid millions of dollars, and everybody watches the Super Bowl, whether it's actually for the football or for the commercials. But it was a really touching ad that you all took out to talk about wind power, and it started with the dog, and it like showed the Clydesdales, and then it like pans across, and it like brought tears to my eyes almost, not just because I love Budweiser, but because it ended with that wind power, and like, this is the future. This is where we're headed. Why the heck did Anheuser-Busch pay all that money to reach out to customers and tell them how their energy, about the energy that goes into brewing their beer?
Yes, thank you. I also wanted to say thank you on behalf of Anheuser-Busch and 18,000 colleagues around the U.S. Thrilled to be here today to talk to you about our sustainability efforts. And if I step back a moment from how we got to that point with Super Bowl, we launched a global renewable electricity goal at the beginning of 2017. We also joined at that time RE100, which is a collective of industries all pledging to get to 100% renewable electricity. We then, fast forward to 2018, launched our 2025 public global goals and also launched those goals here in the US. And those are centric to water stewardship, smart agriculture, renewables and carbon, and circular packaging. So we had this commitment to 100% renewable electricity in the US, but we also had a 25% reduction in carbon across our entire supply chain at that time. One of the successes we've had here in the US is a partnership with Enel Green Power. We signed an agreement with them the end of 2017, and a large-scale utility offsite VPPA came online the beginning of 2018, which essentially is 152 megawatts of power. It's more than half of the entire needs of our US portfolio, and it's much more than 100% of the needs of Budweiser. So it was an enabler for our Budweiser brand to really move forward and talk to our consumers, use the brand to reach our consumers on what we're doing with sustainability and why we're doing it. So you may have noticed, if you've had a Budweiser recently, Charles, I know you have, there is a symbol on pack on every bottle, every can that you now purchase in the US. So we launched last year. It's a small symbol, but it simply states brewed with 100% electricity from wind power. And then we move forward and use the Super Bowl stage to actually talk to our consumers about what we're doing. So it was a critical moment for us. It was an awesome moment for us. I brought tears to my eyes as well, probably because of the work that went into it.
Sure,
but
different reasons. It's okay.
It was a
It
was a stage that we felt was perfect to talk to our consumers about what we're doing.
So that's impressive. So it wasn't just a desk exercise. This wasn't just a paper rec credit thing. You all put steel in the ground and really went wholesale into a big project.
Critical, very important part of our external public goal. We said from day one, we are not going to buy credits, we're going to build. So infrastructure, New infrastructure and additionality was key to our goal, and that was part of our movement forward. We also since then have signed a second deal. It's not operational yet, but we have signed a deal with Recurrent Energy for the other half of all of our needs in the U.S. It will also be a massive utility offsite deal in the state of Texas, 222 megawatts of power, and that will come online in 2021, and essentially then all of our brands will be made with renewable electricity.
That's fantastic. So there's a lot more to come.
Yes.
Ben, I'm going to skip over for you for just a second here and get to Vanessa and stick on the theme of corporate sustainability because it's something that we're seeing tons of. And I know that EDP Renewables, you all have internal corporate sustainability goals, which for a renewables company, explain that a little bit. And then talk to me also about how you are helping companies in the United States, around the world, achieve their sustainability goals and achieve their interests in procuring more direct renewable power. How are you all filling that gap?
Sure. Well, again, I will also thank Cress and this group for having us here. I think this is an exciting time to be talking about these issues. EDP Renewables is the North American headquarters of EDP, a Portuguese utility. EDP, as our parent company, does have very strong sustainability objectives, and we're part of the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. In fact, just this month, we were listed as #1, and not for the first time, in the integrated utility space in sustainability. And so what this index does is count metrics in addition to renewable electricity. It also looks at broad sustainability targets. So it's transparency, it's corporate governance, it's biodiversity. And so we really try to make an impact as a company in all of these things. And I think just inherently with our North American platform, headquartered in Houston, Texas, all we do is build wind farms and solar projects. And so really that's core to our business and our day-to-day. Now, we used to sell most of our power to utilities themselves here in the US, but more and more what we call C&I customers, the corporate and industrial consumers, such as Anheuser-Busch, are the ones that are looking to procure the clean, renewable electricity that we're selling. And so just in recent years, we have signed companies like Amazon Web Services, Nestle, Facebook. A number of these companies are also, as Angie mentioned, part of this RE100, the companies that have committed to 100% renewable electricity. And what's amazing is I checked that list last week. There were 197 companies on that list. This morning, there are 203. So more companies are making this commitment every day, every week. And so what we try to do is, through additionality, build more wind projects, build more solar projects, so that we can provide the electricity needs for those companies who have their own sustainability metrics and who believe in reducing their own carbon footprints.
Yeah, that's a big deal, and it reminds me of one of the statistics our friends with the Business Council for Sustainable Energy put out an annual fact book. And last year, it was something like half of all of the renewables development in this country were because of corporate procurements like those done by Anheuser-Busch and a number of other companies. So it's a really big deal, and I'm happy that you're able to help meet that demand. Ben, I'm not gonna lie, I was a Bird scooter guy first, and then I switched to Lime scooters because there are just more of them. And I like taking them, and I ride around DC, and I don't think anybody could take me seriously if they saw a picture of me on the scooter, but it's a great way to get around, I'm not gonna lie. Tell me a little bit about Lime, the growth that your company has seen. I asked you about the Twitter handle at first in terms of that transition, but when I think of Lime, I think of big cities. I think of my experiences in San Francisco and Los Angeles, where I first started riding scooters, and then here in DC where it finally made it. I hope that someday the scooters come to Annapolis. Tell me a little bit about that growth, and specifically, is it just an urban thing, or what are you doing in rural America?
Sure, a couple things. So yeah, Lime is about a 2-year-old company. We were
2 years old, that's it?
2 years old, yeah.
Wow.
So we were formed in January of 2017, so a little over. We just last week we announced we had 100 million rides. To put that in perspective, is about half the time that Uber took to get to 100 million rides. So scaling incredibly quickly. And I think that part of the message is that we're making it easy for consumers. I think a fairly small percentage of our riders are saying, "Oh, I'm going to choose that scooter because it's way more efficient than a car." They're saying, "I'm going to choose it because it's a great way to get around. You don't have to deal with congestion. You don't have to deal with sitting in traffic and a lot of other things, and it's just fun. You feel the wind wind in your hair, you're going through the city.
It
You
is
get a
fun,
different
yeah.
perspective of the city. You know, you get the intimacy of walking, but the convenience of getting there a lot faster.
Yeah.
So people enjoy it more. And you know, I think that it is filling a niche that was unmet, and that's why it's grown so quickly.
Yeah.
And to your rural versus urban question, our average trip is about 1.25 miles. Most of them are in the mile to 2 mile range, but 1.25 is about the average ride. Oh, okay, sorry. I will use this. Mic not working. All right, thanks. What should I repeat? Anyways, so scooters are, because they're taking that mile and a half trip,
Yeah.
they're not going to meet a need in many rural communities. So, but I think what's more important than rural versus urban is density. Some of our best communities are college towns: Lubbock, Texas; Oxford, Ohio; Columbus, Ohio. These are places where, you know, students and others are in a small, confined area, need to get around, don't have a car, there's not parking.
Yeah.
So scooters really meet a need there. So I think as a form factor, if you're in a fairly rural community, like something like an e-bike would
Yeah.
probably be better for those longer trips, or where you have to carry heavy packages, that sort of thing. But in dense communities, the positive externalities of scooters, which are, you know, no point source emissions, reducing congestion, easy to get around, are very popular.
Gotcha. And I think that's where that rapid growth is, I mean, just phenomenal. It's really impressive to see, and I think that just you see more of the scooters, you see more men and women in suits and whatever cruising around. It's obviously meeting some demand. And the smiles on people's faces, I think, as they go by, is instructive of that. But for Bernadette and Angie, could you talk to me a little bit more? Like, what's the feedback, you know, that you're getting? Obviously, I'm enthusiastic about what you all are doing. There are more meteorologists that you're trying to reach. There are more brands and customers. Are people happy with the information that they're getting and the direction that the company is headed in? I'm not sure if you could speak to that.
I would say absolutely. Our consumers are educated on these topics. They want to know.
Yeah.
There's a consumer demand there. They want to ensure that the products they're buying are made in a responsible way from a responsible company. They want to feel good about what they're buying and the products that they purchase. So I think there's absolutely a connection there to the consumer. And that is why we chose to use our Budweiser brand to bring that conversation to the forefront, to bring it to the consumer and actually inject that into the conversation. So for us, it makes perfect sense. We think about it as what I would call purpose-driven brands. So how do we connect with our consumers in an authentic way to make sure they know what we as a company are doing? We speak to them through our brands.
Yeah, that's great to hear that you've seen that positive feedback. How about for the folks at home? Is it interesting information? I think the numbers on cell phone charging is pretty cool. It seems like a lot. But what's the feedback you've received?
Well, before I jump into that, I want to say, too, I think this is also a sign of how far we've come, that is what's helping sell your product, is that people want this and are interested in it. So from us, from our perspective, we launched this tool for the first time last year around this time. We're just launching 2.0 this week in conjunction with Clean Energy Week, and it's updated metrics, updated installations, updated graphics, and geographic breakdown. So it's not just your market area. You can get into congressional districts and stuff like that and look at different forecast areas. But it's taking a little bit of time. I'm on my cell now with my TV meteorologists of why this is so cool and to bring it in. But we expected that. When we first started talking to them about bringing climate change into their weathercast, it was a slow process.
Really?
But as they understood more of the science and were able to sort through a lot of the misinformation that was in the world and saw what it was doing, because most meteorologists are scientists. And so when they were able to really see what was going on, they themselves started raising their voices more and more, demanding more information, more topics. We bring in beer, actually, and climate change is one of our topics. We bring just a range of topics that they're very interested in learning more about and getting it out to their public to inform their communities about what's going on. And as we've started this conversation, so many of them have said, you're right, that is weather, and you're right, we have a pollen forecast, we have a boating forecast, all of that, so why wouldn't we bring this in? And the other thing too is when you're in this space, as many of you are focused on clean energy, but when you just more broadly work in climate change,
Yeah.
it can be tough at times. It's a very depressing subject matter because the science is, I mean, looking at the IPCC report yesterday, that is hard. That is hard to digest. But the clean
Unfortunately,
energy
yeah.
aspect is so positive. It's a positive way of diving into this subject. And if any of you follow the Yale climate change opinion maps and can really dissect what the public thinks about the subject matter, there is overwhelming support for the topic of clean energy. So it's a really easy way to get into this subject.
So do you see any geographic hotspots? Like, are people more, tuned in and interested in getting the climate energy data in some part of the country, or is it pretty uniform?
It's really been with more of our TV meteorologists who are forward on this subject. The first guy you saw there, Eric Sorensen, he's in Iowa, Quad Cities, Iowa. And so often people come to us and think it's the really liberal areas that are jumping into the subject matter, but that's not necessarily the case. We're having more coverage in Missouri, in Texas, in Iowa, in Florida, than in some of the places like California where you would think they'd be incorporating this more.
Gotcha.
Well, and I would add to that, as a former wind power developer, now I focus on policy, but I do spend a lot of time in rural communities. And I would say 10 years ago, we were basically under the impression that nobody in rural America wanted to talk about climate change. We talked about the economic benefits, we talked about the investment opportunities, but we really steered clear of some of those environmental issues. And now, as we go out to these rural communities in Iowa and Missouri and Kansas, they're talking to us about climate change. And they're saying, look, wind is our drought-resistant cash crop, and climate change is creating these unpredictable drought conditions that we might have to sustain over many years. So they're appreciative of the income that they're getting, but they recognize that the climate is changing and they're feeling those direct impacts. And so that's been encouraging to see that, because I do think the rhetoric largely in political circles is that there still is that sort of urban-rural divide. And what we're seeing developing these projects is it's just not there.
And I'll add one more thing and we can move on to, from the weather side of things, when there's tornado outbreaks and you see all the storm chasing, there are an incredible amount of turbines now in the backgrounds of so many of those, which you did not see in the past. So it's a sign of where things are going.
That's pretty cool. And I think that, Vanessa, just to touch on one point that you hit on in terms of the political challenges, and we heard from two politicians to get this started, I think that's part of the reason that National Clean Energy Week has been such a success. We've got 30 governors across the country that have proclaimed it National Clean Energy Week in their states. House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans came together to proclaim it National Clean Energy Week for the United States. And I think that's a big deal because there are going to be policy divisions, and it's going to break down in terms of some of the specific items. But when it comes to just focusing on all of the above clean energy options, I think that we're seeing a lot of different governors step up to articulate what that means for their state, and specific companies step up to articulate what that means for their business model. And I'm glad that there's increasing flexibility and momentum in pushing that. But for Ben and Vanessa, the growth is exciting. The growth is encouraging. It can't be pain-free, probably. What are some of the headwinds or barriers that you all have come up against? I know that there are some cities where the mayor is, tired of the scooter litter or whatever it is, and have imposed bans. That's probably a natural, cycle of the pendulum swinging. But what are some of the barriers that you all are facing in terms of growth and access to markets to keep on the trajectory that you've been on?
Sure. So scooters are controversial. People love scooters, but other people hate scooters. The positive externalities are all invisible. Okay, efficiency of getting around, invisible. Congestion reduction, invisible. No point source emissions, invisible. No oil and gas runoff from car engines, invisible.
Right.
The negative externalities are incredibly visible. People riding on the sidewalk where they shouldn't be. People parking where they shouldn't be. Scooters knocked over and in big piles. So you don't see any of the positives, and you see very visibly all the negatives.
Yeah.
So people who are reluctant to embrace change often see scooters as a very visible source of things they don't like, and they bring out very strong emotions. Most of our growth thus far has been people using scooters more or expanding into new cities. So for example, in Washington, D.C., We launched with about 500 scooters about a year and a half ago. I think we're only up to 650, and that's because the city doesn't allow us to have more. So, so cities really choose the number of scooters you have. They choose where you can put them. It's very prescriptive compared to many other technologies. So we have, in DC, the usership is so high, we have to have a whole second set of scooters because the battery dies. Yeah. So, in the morning we put out a fresh set, and then, mid-afternoon we start changing them out because we're only allowed to have 650 on the ground at any one time. Really? And the demand is so strong that people just keep riding them. So, we're working within those constraints. The technology is getting better to have bigger batteries. Bigger batteries also take longer to charge, so then that creates other problems. Bigger batteries means they're heavier. An average scooter is 35 pounds. So to put that in perspective, like a Tesla Model 3 is like 3,500 pounds. So we're like 1% of what a Tesla Model 3 weighs. Yeah. So I did the math. The MPG equivalent for a scooter is very high. Yeah. But there are challenges. Many mayors, I think, what you get from departments of transportation mayors a lot is like, I've got enough problems, don't create more problems for me. And when we first came in, we probably weren't as responsible as we could have been in many cities. But I think now it's sort of normalized where we've created societal norms in places where people will act a little bit more responsibly, and cities are really understanding that this can be a benefit to their citizens, to their communities. Arlington is a great example. I was on a panel with Paul Mackey, who's at the Mobility Lab. There's their transportation demand management. How do they get? It's a lot cheaper to get less people on the roads rather than building a new road.
Yeah, so Arlington, Virginia here?
Yeah, Arlington, Virginia. Invests a lot of money in how do they use their roads more efficiently. Sure. And they found scooters were a great way to do that. And again, there's sort of a normalizing. When scooters first came in, there was a lot of complaints, but they worked with us and the other providers, and those complaints really went down. They found it was a great tool for their citizens to use.
Yeah, that's good. I've parked my scooter illegally. I was late to a meeting, so I had to ditch the scooter.
For most places, you can park your scooter anywhere as long as it's out of the way of the walk zone. So the furniture zone of the sidewalk is technically what it's called. Good. Arlington actually has, they were on the cutting edge of what we call corrals. Basically, right outside the metro stations, they took one parking spot, put up bollards, and you can park your bikes and scooters like right outside the metro stop. And that's a great thing because both it eliminates some of that clutter, which was one of the main complaints, but also makes public transit a lot more desirable as a mode of transportation because I've got a 1.5 mile walk from the metro, but I know if there's a bike or a scooter there, I'm going to be more likely to use that mode of transportation. So I can make a better decision. And I think
that Arlington's still on the cutting edge.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that, as everybody's been talking here, the one thing that ties us all together is people will make the right decision if you make it easy for them and you make it visible to them. Like they want to do the right thing, so the easier you can make it, the more people will make those good choices.
That's great. Bernadette, you want to
jump in?
And
they're working on collapsible helmets. As a parent, all you other parents out there, this is a question that I had.
Collapsible helmet doesn't sound good, though.
But he's doing it in a responsible way, because I'm concerned about people's heads, because it is such a cool technology, but they're working on collapsible helmets.
Yes, so I say, anybody that needs a helmet, call me. ben.larocco@li.me is my email address. I'll get you one. I've got 50 of them in the office right now. We give them to anybody that wants one.
Oh, wow.
But we're working on a collapsible one that will only be about 2 inches thick, so that way it would easily fit in a briefcase, in a book bag, so that when people are going around, they can just pop it on, make sure they have it at any times.
And it looks good, or you look like a transformer?
Yeah, it looks great. It looks great. That was really the key, because again, having helmets aren't useful if nobody uses them. So again, it goes back to helping people make the right decision, making it easy for them to do that. So that's what we're trying to figure out how to incentivize people to make those good decisions.
I've got an 8 and an 11-year-old. It's got to look good for them to wear it. So, Vanessa, I do want to get back to you, though, and talk a little bit about pace of growth, constraints to growth, and any roadblocks that you've come up against.
Sure, and I would mention 2 specific challenges that we're facing, both for wind and solar, but I think more so for wind. And that is what Congressman Tonko referred to earlier, which is transmission. Transmission constraints are the fundamental limiting factor to deploying the amount of new wind farms that we'd like to deploy. What's challenging is the fact that it is very difficult to get transmission built, whereas for pipelines, you have a designated FERC process under which these international or interstate lines can be developed and constructed. You don't have anything, a similar sort of backstop for transmission. You have multiple jurisdictions that require approvals, and many of those even go down to the local level. So you might have a tremendous amount of interest in, say, western Kansas, and a lot of demand farther east in the country. But if Missouri doesn't want to see the transmission lines, they won't approve it. And so you've got to go before these commissions. And it makes it difficult because as you move closer to where transmission capacity is still available, you also get closer to populated areas. It's more difficult, just, you know, it's less feasible to build the wind farms there, but you also run into more opposition. And so the economic development, the people who want to see the wind farms in their communities where there is really no other investment coming because they don't have the large populations to populate a new manufacturing facility, for instance. They want to see this development happen, but they can't get it if they don't have those, you know, essentially farm-to-market roads to get those electrons from those places to the city centers that have the highest demand. So that's one challenge that we have, that we're working multiple avenues to try to promote not just policy matters in terms of getting transmission from point A to point B, but also to help educate the community and educate the country that if you see the tremendous demand for renewable energy from not just corporate consumers, but from residential consumers, they need to understand that there's only way to get it to their homes, to their businesses, and you've got to have the transmission and the enabling technology. The other thing that is becoming more of a challenge to us, again, more so I think for wind, but also for solar, is organized opposition, and a lot of that is manufactured opposition that we're seeing oftentimes funded by the technologies that we're disrupting. There are parts of the country where it is cheaper to build a new wind farm than it is to operate an existing coal plant. And so those new economics are really providing the impetus to see more and more of these built.
Sure.
And so what we're seeing, and it's come out more than once, where we have found outside groups, even groups outside the state where a proposed project is under development, coming in to essentially lobby the town boards, the local communities, to try to oppose the project. And so that's something that I think we've just, as an industry, been behind the 8 ball because we were so welcomed for so many years. We are learning to counter that. We're learning to get the facts in front of folks, to get the misinformation dispelled.
Sure.
But it is a challenge because it's something as developers, it lengthens the process, it makes it more expensive. And so we, you know, in each community have ambassadors that we try to cultivate who can speak to their own community members to help bring them on board and understand where some of this opposition is coming from.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think that it is difficult, and I think that for those of us that have been in this industry for some time, there have been a lot of growing pains, there have been a lot of successes, but really we're talking at a massive scale about changing, you know, behavior, and that's not something that necessarily happens overnight. Bernadette, one of the things that you said is that, you know, when you're focused on the climate change and you read the report and the sea level rise, it's like, it's kind of a bummer. And here at National Clean Energy Week, we're firmly focused not just on the benefits, the environmental benefits, the climate change benefits, but what you'll hear from various speakers throughout the day is talking about some of the other components in terms of what investments in clean energy mean for national security, what it means for jobs and economic growth, and I think that some of you have hinted at that. But what makes you optimistic that we're headed on the right track? And that the work that you're doing is having an impact, because I think that that's an important part of the equation too. If you're going to get up and go to work tomorrow, you know, Angie, where are you seeing? You're seeing these successes. You're seeing demand. Is the momentum picking up, and you're getting more corporate support, or do you feel like it's still you know long stretch goals that are difficult to achieve, or do you feel like this is possible to meet those sustainability goals?
You know, I think we have had success here in the U.S., but we still have a long way to go. And what's critical for us is we know and understand that we also have to change our supply chain. So I mentioned our goal around renewables and carbon, our 25% reduction in our supply chain. It's a science-based target. Yep. And we have 80% of our entire footprint that sits outside of our direct control. So when you think about it, it's more than offsetting our entire you know, scope 1, scope 2 emissions in our supply chain. When you talk about a 25% reduction, it's massive. We don't know how we're going to get there yet, but we know that we will have to have strong partnerships, strong collaborations, external input, external innovation, and work directly with our suppliers to change and drive that change forward.
Gotcha. Bernadette, what gives you hope?
Well, there's a lot of things that give me hope. One, the youth movement. Look what's been going on just over this past week.
Yeah.
I mean, they're finding their voice and they're demanding that we make changes, and that's our next wave. They're going to be taking our jobs in a couple of years. So that is one thing that gives me hope. Two, that it is taking over commercials on the Super Bowl. I mean, that's not just a moral thing. That means people are interested in this. So public demand for this is growing, and interest and understanding of this, and that we have to. We have to have hope.
Yeah.
People talk about the 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius goal. Every 10th of a degree matters and has huge impacts in our life, our lifestyles, our health, the things that we love, the people that we love. And we have to have hope because we need to do this.
Ben,
So
go ahead.
did anybody just watch the Netflix special on Bill Gates?
Yes.
So the 3-part special, it's super fascinating. They're only like 40 minutes each, so it's not a huge commitment. Very interesting. But
I like where this is going already.
the third one is all about TerraPower, which is his like nuclear energy thing, which honestly, I watched that and I have been doing nothing but like reading about TerraPower for the last like 3 days since I Googled that, or since I watched it. And I say that because like I am a techno optimist. I feel really confident that as this problem becomes more real in people's lives. It's been pretty abstract for a long time. It's still somewhat abstract to a lot of people that aren't dealing with this every day. But as it becomes a more real problem for people, they will make decisions that are also better decisions, and they also will demand more resources get put into making smart energy decisions and making investments in technology that makes sense. And I really think that I mean, maybe I'm naively optimistic. I am sometimes, often maybe. But I really feel like we are going to be able to make the right decisions that will negate a lot of the bad decisions that we've made before. So I hope I'm right.
So that brings up a question, though, and Bernadette, I mean, because we've seen such dramatic changes in the solar and wind industry and the weather power tool, has that had to undergo a couple of rounds of updates to account for changes in technology and distribution? Like, how are the data maintained, and how do you keep that tool still meaningful and up to date? Because I imagine that as we get more and more efficient, you're able to provide more power and export more power and charge more cell phones and do all of that. Is it an ongoing project? Like, it's not just one and done.
Oh, it absolutely is. My colleague is here right now, Karen. This is a project we're always working on, and it's a passion project for a lot of us too. So we are a nonprofit and we are resource dependent, but we are pushing this through. We're constantly working on it. We did version 1.5. This is 2.0. We have like 8.0 in our mind of things we already want to do with this. So yes, we're constantly working on this.
That's good. Vanessa, then how are at EDP Renewables in terms of the trajectory that you're on? Corporate confidence is high that things are moving in the right direction. Next week, you and I are going to be doing a training, out in Iowa to help some legislators better understand how the technology has evolved, how price points have changed. This is an ongoing education, effort too, to get people to understand, what has changed. The message is being well received.
I think it is. Because you have sort of the entire value chain, I think, being hit upon. You've got the energy that's being created that is satisfying the demand of a lot of folks who want to see their electricity come from clean sources. You have the economic development that is deployed en masse. And I have some figures. In the last 10 years, the wind industry alone has provided $130 billion in private investment across the U.S.
Wow.
We pay annually about $300 million in landowner payments. The majority of those are in low-income counties. We pay $760 million a year in tax payments. Those tax payments go to state jurisdictions, local governments, and school districts. And so what we're seeing in places that are finding challenges, for instance, in state government, it was very well documented across the country, the number of teacher strikes that were happening. And I spent a lot of time in Oklahoma during this time. And there are fundamental issues with public education funding, and that's not really where we sit. But those teachers who worked in Oklahoma, where wind was not part of the community, where they did not have that revenue to those school districts, teachers were now on strike because they were on 4-day work week or 4-day school weeks. They were not getting the resources they needed. Whereas when a wind farm was part of the community, they were able to utilize that revenue, ensure that the teachers were paid well, that the classrooms were funded well, that they had the resources, the iPads in some cases, new football stadiums in some cases, and that's happening all over the country. So people are seeing a direct benefit in those local communities. And then I think, you know, because climate change has become a much more salient issue, because I think in conversations I've had up here on the Hill with a lot of Republicans who are saying, you know, this is affecting my state, this is affecting my district. Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter when you're seeing in Florida the value of real estate, the projection of real estate values plummeting because the sea level will rise and you've got essentially high dollar real estate projected to be underwater. It's really meaningful. There are really important economic concerns. And so I think the conversation has shifted more to what can we do about it. And so I find that encouraging. I think, you know, with the legislators we'll be meeting with in Iowa, they're coming from multiple states. They'll be touring a wind farm and they'll be touring a blade manufacturing facility. You're seeing in the clean energy economy a tremendous amount of jobs being created. And it's not just, you know, those of us at corporate headquarters. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has cited solar PV installer as the #1 growing job of the next decade and wind turbine technician #2. And that's for the next 10 years.
For the next decade?
For the next decade.
It's already been that for the last decade.
And so, and in fact, it was just a couple years ago that solar beat wind in terms of, you know, having the number of jobs. Of course, there are a lot of behind-the-meter distributed applications that are beyond what wind provides. But it's really exciting to see a new crop of talent coming into the labor pool doing things that weren't even contemplated a generation ago. And one of the things that we try to do is coordinate with local community colleges, technical colleges, to provide the resources they need to ensure that the jobs they're training for will be relevant. It's funny, there's the Cloud County Community College up in northern Kansas is a place that we've been interacting with for many, many years. We help provide the seed funding to get their wind technician program off the ground. They've just added a solar technician program. They said their biggest challenge is their abysmal graduation rate.
Really? Because
they get a bunch of people come into the program, they have a summer internship at a wind farm, and they get hired on the spot. They never go back to finish the program. And so it's a good problem to have.
It's a good problem, yeah.
And so when we
need to
see
make that a
kind of
one-year
demand-
program.
Exactly. So they're looking into that. And
I wish that would have
providing
been my case in college. It wasn't. I had to look for a job. It was hard.
But these are the telltale signs, I think, that the conversation is moving in the right direction. And it's not, is this happening, is this not, is this the right direction to go, but how can we help?
That's great, and I think the development component of it is a major one, and that's one where I step back and I look at the need to reduce emissions globally. Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, my organization, we're firm believers in creating as many technological options as possible and focusing hard on reducing costs, because this isn't just a U.S. problem. And if those are technologies that we can develop and deploy globally, later we'll hear from a very cool company, Solid Carbon Products, that is focusing on taking what was otherwise CO2 waste and building useful products out of it, which would be creating jobs in areas where there weren't jobs before. Ben, I know that you all are doing more work in developing countries. Could you talk a little bit about how that expansion has looked and what that means for some of the other countries, you know, that you're working in? We're running a little bit tight on time, but if you could speak to that real briefly, that'd be great.
Sure. I just say that we operate in 25 countries, over 100 cities around the world. Particulate emissions is a very serious problem in many places. In a lot of those developing places, you know, there's mopeds and things that are very loud. A lot of emissions that are coming out of them. So electric vehicles, small light electric vehicles, the average scooter costs $500-600 wholesale. So if you can take those things and you know, provide them to a place where the average income is, you know, a couple $100 a year or a couple $1,000s a year, it's a great new option for people compared to a tuk-tuk or other things. So I think not only scooters, but the electrification of the vehicles that people are currently using holds a lot of promise. There are other infrastructure problems that I think if you invest in some things that will be able to provide a lot of other services, but like you know, the fact that cell phones are so ubiquitous, you know, fishermen in Yemen are able to detect the price of their catch so they can go to the right port. But you know, cell phone GPS, mobile payments is really hard in many developing countries, so that actually is a big problem for us. Like, how do you actually charge people? When
really?
They don't have credit cards or bank accounts. We're dealing with that in certain places. So,
Huh.
So I think but those are also things that once you develop those technologies for one use, they can be used in many different ways, and so they can really, they can really make people's lives better, improve them in many different ways. So
It's fantastic. For me, I've learned a lot as a part of this conversation, so thanks to all of you. Any closing thoughts that you want to leave our audience with here? Or
Thank you.
Did we cover it all?
Thank you for having this conversation. I love when we get unique perspectives and jobs together, because I feel like we always get richer and have a more in-depth conversation and learn more through that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, for us, this is awesome. Thank you for having us.
Sure,
and
absolutely.
certainly want to continue the conversations we're having today. And I know that our success lies with partnership and collaboration.
Wonderful.
So I just want to say that, one, I love the visualization of cell phones charged, because that's such a thing that everybody does every day. And finding ways to quantify things in ways that people understand is great. And the next time I'm deciding whether I want to have a beer or not have a beer at the end of the day, I'm going to have one because I know I'm helping the environment. So that's gonna be great.
If we've learned one thing today,
Drinking Budweiser is great for the
gonna
world.
be a good thing.
I will buy you a beer.
Yes, honey, I promise. This is good for the world. That's why I'm having this.
Yeah.
And I would echo that thanks. And I would say, I think it's important for policymakers to recognize that the constituents coast to coast are there. And so to the extent there's any question of whether or not this is an important policy priority, I think really it's just a matter of going out to, whether it's urban districts or rural districts, there's something there for everyone when it comes to renewable energy, to clean energy. And so strong, forward-looking policies can only be a good thing for all.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. For me, this is, it really crystallizes kind of some of the assumptions and really my best hopes for what we would cover today. I encourage everyone in the audience to stick around. We're going to hear from a lot of different great companies, fair share of additional politicians who have hopefully got good things and announcements to make. So thank you to my panel right here. If we could provide them with a warm round of applause. Thank you for your attention. Thanks so much.
Thank you. That's great.
Yeah, this was good. Yeah, appreciate it. I'll take this.